One day in Manhattan, clear as could be, till the planes hit the buildings and changed history. They stood for an hour once the damage was done, but then suddenly crumbled. 10 seconds they were gone. There were cascading projections of steel into dust. It looked like explosions, but it was not discussed. So I turned off the TV and shut out the lights. It's all just illusion, right in front of my eyes. Well, I'm not scared of dying. We're all bound for heaven, just sharing the truth about 9/11. Now building number 7 dropped the cleanest of all. Yet the world still knows nothing of this amazing free fall. There was no real reason. It wasn't hit by a plane. They say it was a fire, yet you can't see the flames. You see cascading projections of steel into dust. Looks like demolition, but it's never discussed. So I turn off the TV and shut out the lights. It's all just illusion, right in front of my eyes. Well, I'm not scared of dying. We're all bound for heaven, just sharing the truth about 9/11. They say that the bigger the lie, the more people believe, and the deeper the fear, the more easily we are.
I'll just bring it on back. Yeah, the more easily we are deceived. That was the rest of that line. We played that video so much, I think we've messed it up. But, okay, today's a special day. It's December 7th, and to many that automatically triggers the idea, oh yeah, Pearl Harbor Day. And for the longest time, it was commemorated as if it was a surprise attack by the Japanese. Unfortunately, we know now that it wasn't, and that was because of a recent declassified document that shows that the President of the United States knew, and that he purposely ordered the radars that could detect the incoming planes to be dismantled and moved or upgraded or whatever it was. I'm not an expert on that cover-up, but see, it's an important day because remember it in 2001, the group called Progress or Program for a New American Century, the PNAC group, with all of the bad people that we've seen in the Bush administration, they called for a catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. And, you know, they used it exactly the way it was used in the original Pearl Harbor, which was to get the people behind going to war, you know, where they might not have originally. And we've got to see the biggest enemy that the cover-ups have is time. We just had an anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and we all saw how terribly that was handled. I mean, we know that the Warren Commission is a lie. We know it's a lie. We know that there was a squad of shooters, 3 or more shooters, all shooting at once. There was a hail of bullets. And yet, every official story I mean, every commemoration that you saw on TV was just a repeat of the official story. Nobody talked about the truth that we all know now. The same thing happened with Pearl Harbor today. Before I came in to this show, I watched a rehash of Pearl Harbor, how it was a surprise attack. It caught everybody by surprise, and so many men died. Well, those people died because of a direct order from our president. And see, what do these things have in common? It's the cover-up. They don't even dare let you talk about how the U.S. government lied about something that significant and did something so evil, because you might start asking questions. Okay, well, we know that they covered up the new Pearl Harbor, the original Pearl Harbor. Okay, we know that they covered up John F. Kennedy. They're still running the cover-up to this minute. And we know that they're covering up 9/11. Now, 9/11 can be divided into two parts pretty easily. I mean, the one part is, the orchestration and the execution of the collapse of the structures. That's one part of 9/11, completely separate from all the rest. This other part of 9/11 was the cover-up, and that involved the patsies, the airplanes, the media afterwards running the story over and over again, and so on. And then, to this day, continuing to portray anybody who talks about it as some sort of a nutcase, total denial of what exists. And in that vein, we're going to play a video, and this one is, it's a part of a four-parter. This is part of part 2, I think. But basically, it's an interview by Paul Jay of the Real News Network, which is a real good place to get your news and analysis. And he's interviewing Bob Graham, former Senator Bob Graham, and they're talking about the connection with the Saudis during 9/11. And now what these guys are really going over, without saying it, and that's why I say Bob Graham is actually part of the cover-up, is because the thing that they're discussing is the cover-up side of 9/11, and they're not admitting what actually happened. They're talking about, all this. I mean, all this other intrigue that he's talking about may have happened, but they're not admitting that's somebody detecting the setup of the cover-up, the setup of the patsies. That took a lot of orchestration. It took a lot of time to get the patsies into the country, to get them into the airplanes. They had to be trained on U.S. bases, and everybody ignores that. Well, anyway, so keep in mind while you watch this, and I'll cut it off when I can't stand it anymore, but this is Bob Graham being interviewed by Paul Jay on the Real News Network.
Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself with Senator Bob Graham. We're talking about the Saudi role in the events of 9/11 and Saudi's influence on U.S. foreign policy. The biography of Senator Graham in length you will find below our video player here, but just quickly again. Senator Graham was the 38th governor of Florida from 1979 to 1987. He was a U.S. senator from Florida from 87 to 2005. He was on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he chaired the Congressional Joint Committee on 9/11. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
And I should say Senator Graham also is author of the book Intelligence Matters, the CIA, the FBI, Saudi Arabia, and the Failure of American War on Terror. So one question that's always kind of bothered me, because I personally haven't been able to find something obvious about this, and there's so much to read, and I haven't read it all, but it's been reported that Prince Bandar, who was then the Saudi ambassador to the United States, within hours of 9/11, contacts what we now know must have been President Bush, because the heads of all the other agencies, it was very interesting at 9/11 Commission, they kept asking to the head of the FBI, did you authorize these flights to get Saudis out of the country? I said no, and then the CIA said no. But I think it's fairly well known now it was the White House. But Prince Bandar, within hours of the attack, wants to get leading Saudis out of the country because 15 of the 19 conspirators on the planes are Saudis. Well, how does he know within hours of the attack that there's so many Saudis involved in this?
It doesn't surprise me that he knew that. Now, at the worst, you can say he knew it because he was aware that this plot was developing before 9/11. At the best, his press people had access to the wire services, which quickly did identify that 15 of the 19 people were Saudis. So I'm not...
How did the American government and then the wire services, how did anyone know so quickly?
Well, they quickly found out who the people were because they had their names on the manifest of the 4 airplanes which they had entered. And some of these people, once their names popped up, were well known to the intelligence agencies. 2 of them had participated in what's referred to as the Summit of Terrorists that took place in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia in January of 2000. Others were not as well known, but it didn't take long to determine something as basic as what were the nationalities of these 19 people. So that doesn't surprise me. What does surprise me is the reaction of the United States, and I think this was at the highest level, the President of the United States, how they reacted to this request. Here you have a mass murder, mainly U.S. citizens killed. Here you've got people who might have information about this mass murder that law enforcement would like to fully interrogate before they were out of our jurisdiction. And yet the President of the United States agreed at the request of the Saudi ambassador to allow a chartered plane to fly from Lexington, Kentucky back to the Middle East with 144 persons who had not been pre-screened, interviewed, or in any meaningful manner debriefed in terms of what they knew about this situation. After the flight, the FBI said, had we known that who these people were, we would in fact have interviewed a number of them.
So how do you explain
people of interest? I think the explanations are murky, and there are many. One is that the United States has had a special relationship with Saudi Arabia that goes back to World War II. We provide them defense cover. They provide us a reliable source of petroleum. Some of it was the special relationship with the Bush family. Going back to the president's grandfather, there had been a close family relationship between the Bushes and the House of Saud. Other reasons might have to do with the fact that Saudi Arabia was looked at as being a source of stability in a very turbulent Middle East, and that we needed to keep their credibility and respond to their request. Bandar had said that precisely because 3/4 of the hijackers had been Saudis, that put all persons of Saudi ancestry in the United States at some risk, and he selected who he thought were the ones that were most at risk, most prominent, probably closest to the royal family to have this.
And members of the bin Laden family.
Yes, there were several members of the bin Laden family, which meets both tests. They were members of the bin Laden family, and that family was itself close to the royal family. And at a time when the request was made, most aviation in the United States was grounded. By the time they actually executed the flight, that restriction had largely been lifted.
I think the big issue isn't how could the plane fly. The big issue is how did they let a plane fly with people that might have been involved in the events.
because they weren't very curious as to what those people had known, or there were, I think more likely, there were factors that went beyond finding out about 9/11 that trumped the normal policy of full briefing and interrogation, or debriefing and interrogation, before people were allowed to leave the country.
We'll kind of get into this as we move along, but does there not seem to you, and in your book you outline various points at which the 9/11 attacks could have been prevented?
About a dozen.
Does there not seem to have been almost a culture, it's almost deliberately created, not that goes beyond lack of curiosity? And like I don't understand this. If you become, you're president, you take over a new administration. Your head of CIA comes in his first briefing, and according to George Tenet, he tells President Bush the #1 security threat to the United States is bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And then they demote Richard Clark. How do you demote your terrorism, anti-terrorism czar, and at a time when you've been told this is your biggest national security threat? If you don't like Clark, fine, you get somebody else. But why would you reduce his level, which was more or less cabinet level access, to when, like Clark testifies at 9/11, he couldn't get anyone's attention. He says, our hair was on fire. There was so much going on that summer that we thought something might be coming, and we couldn't get anyone's attention. It's almost like they don't, like it goes beyond almost that lack of curiosity.
Yeah, this culture of protection of the Saudis ran up and down the ranks of the federal government. A very significant event occurred at the Orlando airport in 2001, early in the year, when a man arrived from Saudi Arabia and was seen by one of the agents at the airport, one of the customs agents, as being suspicious. And so they interviewed him to find out, why would a person have flown all the way from Saudi Arabia to Orlando for what appeared to be just a few days, maybe even hours, before he turned around and flew back. There had been some instances in which professional hitmen were brought into the United States to carry out a murder and then quickly leave. And the customs agent was suspicious that that might be such a person. So he refused the man the right to enter the United States. He was severely chastised by other customs agents who said, your career is now over, because don't you remember we were told that we're supposed to treat Saudis differently than we treat other people? But he persisted, and in fact the man was returned without ever gaining legal access to the United States. That may have been, probably was, the 20th hijacker who would have filled out the ranks of the 5 people on each of the 4 planes. But even at the level of a customs agent at an airport in the United States, the idea that Saudis were going to be treated with greater deference was an accepted part of the operation. You can imagine what it was like as you moved up into the higher ranks of the federal government.
Well, if you combine that with what was clearly a message that was sent throughout the police, through the FBI, to the intelligence agencies, that we're not very interested in terrorism anymore. Colleen Rowley, that was part of the FBI group in Minneapolis that tried to get a warrant for Moussaoui, who was this guy learning to take off and not land, and the air flight instructor tells the local FBI office, and they cannot get the warrant. FBI headquarters won't give them the warrant to go get the computer. And that's a longer, detailed story, and if people want, they can go watch. We've interviewed Colleen Rowley. But I asked Colleen, what did you make of this? I mean, why? And she said, there just seemed to be, coming from the top, a culture, don't follow terrorism. We're not interested in it.
Yeah. And we had a number of instances.
Yeah, well, I decided to call that the end right there. It's a 4-parter, and if you're really interested, go to TRNN, excuse me, The Real News Network with Paul J., and watch the rest of that yourself. They really get into good detail, And I'm sure most of it's true, but they're talking as if that was the plot. If they'd stopped that, they would have stopped 9/11. No, if they'd stopped that, they would have just made the patsies a little more difficult to deploy. That's all. They wouldn't have stopped 9/11. But okay, a couple of announcements. First of all, starting in January, this show will be every Saturday. No more first and third and things like that. You won't be missing it. You just remember every Saturday live at 5. That'll be right here. Every Saturday live at 5. And since I'll be able to cover things on a more timely basis, I won't have to cram so many videos in, and I'll be able to open up the open up the telephone for live television communications. You can come and say whatever you want. And one more announcement. David Chandler, the high school physics teacher who made NIST change their story about free fall with Building 7, has moved to Oregon, to Portland, to the Portland area. And he got a hold of me, and we have already taped an interview, which as soon as I get it processed, we'll have it on probably in the next 2 weeks. I hope, real fast. I hope. Anyway, that's a exclusive interview with David Chandler right here on Cable Access. We scoop the big boys again. And anyway, back to the thing that I was saying earlier about all the different cover-ups. The cover-up of the original Pearl Harbor, the cover-up of the new Pearl Harbor, and the cover-up of John Kennedy at Dealey Plaza. They herded the protesters into a free speech zone, folks. And so we're going to start a new category here on this show called a free speech zone. And I've got it with barbed wire and everything. I made that graphic myself. Okay. Well, anyway, you can tell I'm a little proud of it because it tells the story. It really does. This is a free speech zone right now. We're on a free speech zone. It's called Cable Access TV. And we better take advantage of it before it's gone. So if you have any idea of just sitting back and watching somebody else do the work for you, that ain't going to last. Well, we'll see what happens. But anyway, free speech zone is an interesting concept for for herding all the protesters in. It's really Orwellian. But I guess what we need to do is realize that, as I said, the worst enemy of the cover-up is time ticking by, and of course the internet gives us, the best access to information. But we're coming up to another anniversary. JFK has a little brother who got assassinated, 6 years after his brother. So it's not the 50th anniversary for RFK, but that's coming up. And of course, Malcolm X, and we all know that none of those happened the way the official story happened. And they're in a desperate drive to not admit anything about a cover-up on any of these things, even though it's absolute public knowledge. They dare not admit it, because once they admit the government covers things up and things that important, you'll start asking, what about Waco? What about Oklahoma City? What about the 9/11 bombing in 1993? What about everything else you've ever heard of? Are they lying about that too? I'll say confidentially, and you can say you heard it here. Yes, they are. Okay, well, that brings us to the NSA spying. Not only do they lie, but they spy. And I love that little emblem that I had on the show the other day, or it said, the NSA, the only part of the government that actually listens. And then their little motto is, we peep while you sleep. Okay, whoever invented that was right on top of it. Okay, well, this is a little 3-minute, 3:45 or something like that. A new group is on the scene. I'll let it speak for itself. This is Stop Watching Us.
Revelations that have emerged in the past few months from whistleblower Edward Snowden and others
have painted a disturbing picture of widespread, suspicionless surveillance of American citizens.
We got a wake-up call just recently. NSA snooping includes the interception and collection of call detail records and internet traffic,
including audio, video, photographs, documents, chat logs, and emails.
Every American is at risk for getting caught up in the NSA dragnet,
including average citizens not suspected of a crime.
We have also learned of the large-scale collaboration with telecom giants, internet companies, and service providers.
Some concerned email providers have chosen to shut their doors rather than cave to government subpoenas to hand over their users' data.
We've been misled.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
We've seen this story before.
We've had too much secrecy in this country. It has corrupted the government.
And we decided it was wrong.
It was wrong then, and it's wrong now.
This is a fearful situation. The American people, one of the basic rights is the right to privacy.
Unrestrained, illegal, secret intimidation and harassment of the essential ability of Americans to participate freely in American political life shall never happen again.
Nixon's crimes predated widespread internet use by decades.
The tools for surveillance have never been more powerful, and the threat to our civil liberties has never been greater.
Edward Snowden was not the first. I represent 6 NSA whistleblowers who are being charged with espionage for telling the truth.
We truly, as a nation, are at a crossroads.
I became aware they were sweeping up everybody's data indiscriminately.
What I was eyewitness to was the subversion of the Constitution. And that was when the hair on the back of my neck went up. And so I became a whistleblower.
This is our information.
This is our information.
This is our information.
This is our information.
It is the digital archive of our lives.
Texts of our chats with our families.
It's the backbone of everything that we care for, our humanitarian causes and things that we fight for.
It is everything you use the internet for.
History tells us we need to watch the watchers.
And in a surveillance state, democracy itself is dead.
It makes a mockery of our system of government, which is based on the notion of independent branches of government, including a fourth estate, the press.
A free society should not have secret laws.
It doesn't have to present this false trade-off between security or privacy.
We need to bring NSA activity from the shadows into the light of day.
We need to end mass, suspicionless surveillance.
Okay, stopwatching.us. You ought to go to that site and check it out. There's a lot of people that are really up in arms. It's about time. You know, we wondered what the tipping point would be when, you know, the general public started getting involved in this type of thing. And, you know, how many times have you heard somebody say, what are you afraid of if it makes us safer? And they've interviewed people. I've seen them recently on the mainstream media, which, yes, I still painfully watch. Just, I don't know if it's something wrong with my psychology or if I can mask it with looking for information. But, man, oh, man. It's just amazing. They don't get it. They plain don't get it. So here's an answer that I have for that. And I put this on a blog, which I'll just read it directly. This is my own composing here. It's not concerned about NSA spying. The next time somebody implies that if you're not doing anything wrong, you should not be opposed to surveillance. Ask them to give you all their passwords to their email, websites, voice messaging, banking, Facebook, Twitter, blogs, cell phones, and social networking accounts and other computers. And when they balk at that, just ask them, if you've got nothing to hide, what are you afraid of? Okay? I mean, if that doesn't convince them, they're just brain dead meadow muffins, and that's all there is to it. Check them off your list and move on. Okay, well, we've got another thing going on here. While I was on the web, the 911blogger.com. If you haven't been there before, you should probably visit them. They have all kinds of things going on. They keep up with the latest news. In fact, if you notice right here, this is Kevin Ryan's new book, and they were the first ones to let me know that it even existed. It was 911blogger.com. But here's the latest news. It was on there December 4, okay, so it's not quite completely timely. But Representative Walter Jones, Republican of North Carolina, introduced a resolution this week in the House of Representatives urging President Barack Obama to declassify 28 pages of a joint House and Senate Intelligence Committee report that includes information concerning foreign governments' involvement in the terrorist attack in the U.S. of 9/11. Okay, the George W. Bush administration redacted the pages from December 2002 report of the Joint Inquiry into the Intelligence Community activities before and after the terrorist attacks of September 2001. What are they, if they don't have anything to hide, what are they afraid of? We should just reverse it on them, okay? Well, we're going to bring you a little clip here. Glenn Greenwald, this is now a little bit older clip, but it's still very, very relevant. Glenn Greenwald is the one who was orchestrating the release of some of the Edward Snowden documents that he, the whistleblower Edward Snowden. And he wrote a book. That is to say, Glenn Greenwald wrote a book. So we're going to go play this interview with Glenn Greenwald.
Running throughout tonight's show is the failure of our judicial system to hold accountable people in positions of power, from those on Wall Street to Big Pharma. Glenn Greenwald, in his latest book, With Liberty and Justice for Some, details for us how our plutocracy has managed to rise above the reach of the law. He argues that in the last 4 decades, the bedrock of our democracy, equality under the law, has incrementally been sabotaged by a political and financial elite that shields itself from accountability. Joining me now is Glenn Greenwald, a contributing writer at Salon.com. His book, With Liberty and Justice for Some, is now out in paperbacks. Great to see you, Glenn. Thanks for coming in. And
My
spectacular
pleasure.
book.
Thank you.
So your thesis is that we are now no longer a nation of one rule of law, but really two populations, one oblivious to the law and the other subject to it. When did this begin and why?
Well, I mean, I would say just, that it's not so much even that one is subject and one isn't. It's that they're in different universes. You have the elites who have committed some of the most egregious crimes imaginable in the last decade. Torture, spying on Americans without the warrants required by law, massive systemic financial fraud that precipitated the crisis, none of which has resulted in any legal accountability. And yet at the very same time, the same elite class that has vested itself with this immunity has implemented for everybody else, not just a legal system or system of punishment, but the Western world's harshest and most oppressive system of punishment. We imprison more of our citizens than any other country in the world by far for more trivial transgressions for longer periods. So you have this extreme impunity for a small elite class and the exact opposite world for everybody else.
I don't want to spend too much time on history, but has it always been thus? Is this a recent phenomenon, or was this the case in the 1820s as well?
Right, and that was really your question. So, I think if you look at American history, obviously, if you're extremely wealthy and well-connected, you've always had advantages in the legal system. You could afford better counsel. You had more deference from judges. You had ways to get out of the law because of political connections. The difference was, though, that we always affirmed the principle that the rule of law required that everybody play by the same set of rules, even though we violated it and breached it in all sorts of ways. What has really happened in the last several decades, and I trace it to the Ford pardon of Nixon, is that we've created this mindset where we expressly repudiate the idea of the rule of law. We have a whole series of arguments now about why, if you're sufficiently important or prominent or instrumental to the functioning of the country, it's better for the country to simply move beyond your crimes and not hold you accountable. That was the argument Gerald Ford made to justify the pardon of Nixon. It's what now gets hauled out every time we go to immunize elites, whether it's the Iran-Contra scandal, the Bush crimes, Wall Street. That it's really an explicit repudiation of that principle rather than just a violation of it.
It's almost too big to fail applied to individuals.
Exactly. And
are you surprised that with President Obama, who came in certainly with the aura of change, a new ethos about the law and equality, that there have been some of these transgressions you just talk about, Wall Street torture, for instance, have been under his watch? Does this surprise you?
It does, and the reason is that if you look at what he was saying during the campaign, the very first speech that he gave when he announced his candidacy, and the very first paragraph of that speech, one of the promises he made was that, quote, the era of Scooter Libby justice will be over. And Scooter Libby justice, of course, is if you're sufficiently politically well connected like he was, even when you get convicted in the federal court of multiple counts of perjury, you're going to have someone intervene on your behalf and ensure that you spend no jail time. And so not only that, but specifically he was often asked, will there be war crimes investigations? And he always said, nobody's above the law. I will have my attorney general investigating it. As soon as he got into office, it became clear that he was signaling in all kinds of ways that he didn't want any investigation.
And specifically with respect to the terror, with the torture inquiries, he said we want to look forward, not backwards, which is exactly opposite to what the rule of law requires. You must look backwards in order to impose rule of law on malefactors.
Right. You were a prosecutor. I don't think you ever prosecuted anybody without looking backward. Crimes are not committed in the future.
Right.
And
except in the Matrix. Great movie,
or the majority report. Yeah, the majority report. And I think, it would be one thing if this kind of grave leniency were available to everybody. So if you got stopped by a police officer for speeding and you could say, look, officer, why don't we look to the future and not the past? If that would work, you could at least have an argument about whether leniency was a good criminal justice policy, but at least it wouldn't implicate the rule of law. It's because it's available only to a tiny percentage of our citizens is it such a problem.
If Mitt Romney becomes president, will it matter? Specifically, the issue you talk about, this dichotomy in terms of the way the rule of law is imposed upon different classes of people. Or will President Obama to Mitt Romney not really matter because they're both part of the same plutocracy?
Well, there's an amazing article from December 2008 when it became clear that Obama was telling everybody that he didn't want any prosecutions after he led everyone to believe that he would. And what it said was the reason this happens is because there's a gentleman agreement between the parties and the president where once a president gets into office, he doesn't investigate anything that happened before him and then therefore guarantees that he will never be investigated. It's really a license of lawlessness. And so, sure, Romney will continue this agreement because he will ultimately benefit from it as well.
Well, there's certainly no question. As you say, the logic is if you're in that class that benefits from it, disrupting the system is antithetical to self-interest. It happens to be consonant with one's pledge to uphold the law, but of course that gives way. What are the most egregious examples that you've seen in the past 10, 20 years?
I think, we talk about a lot about torture, but I actually think the most egregious crime of the Bush years, the clearest cut criminality, was the spying on American people without the warrants required by FISA, because you really read that statute and it says anyone who eavesdrops.
FISA, not Pfizer the pharmaceutical, FISA the foreign. It's a special court that's designed to get them.
You can really read that law. It really does say, and it did for 30 years, that anybody who spies on the American people without complying with the statute is committing a felony punishable by a $5,000 fine, $10,000 fine, and 5 years in prison for each offense. They did that in thousands of cases.
All right, Glenn Greenwald, his book With Liberty and Justice for Some is now out in paperback. Do you have time to continue this conversation on web? We're not subject to the red light going on and losing our satellite.
It would be much more relaxing. I'd love to.
I won't be more relaxing. I'm going to grill you, but we're going to do it anyway.
All right.
All right. That's Viewpoint for tonight. Stay tuned to Enter the War Room right here with Jennifer Granholm. Throughout tonight's show is the failure of
19 investigating legitimate 9/11 suspects. People keep talking about, well, who did it? Who did it? Well, about the best investigation that we have is the 19 that we just got there. Oh, you might also go ahead and bring, see synthetic terror. That's a good one too. But right here, crossing the Rubicon. That one goes into great detail about how the military stood down, for instance. How did it happen without actually giving a stand down order? And by the way, the confusion of how many different war drills were going on at the same time, it's an unprecedented, up in the 40s now, I understand. Well, I like my free speech zone background. And by the way, I have one more show this year. It's on the 21st, I guess, 14 days from tonight. And after that, starting in January, it'll be every Saturday. But I think what I'll use this free speech zone for is the background when I actually go to live calls. And we're going to play one more video right now. It's Abby Martin, and she discovered something really funny. Well, it's funny if it wasn't so serious. But, all this pressure that the NSA is getting for the illegal spying, and when we say illegal, you just heard what Greenwald was talking about, $1,000 and 5 years in jail per occurrence, or something like that. I didn't catch it exactly, and they've been doing it hundreds and hundreds and thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Anyway, so the NSA came up with some talking points for their employees to use around the Thanksgiving table. And here's Abby Martin telling us about it.
1% of Edward Snowden's NSA leaks. A stunning admission considering the nonstop revelations that have come forth since early June. And with all the negative press since, it's not a surprise that the agency feels the need to fight back. What is surprising, however, is a discovery made by my next guest. That the NSA actually gave their employees a list of talking points defending the agency that they could use in discussion with their family and friends over the Thanksgiving holiday. Kevin Gostola, investigative journalist for the website Firedog Lake, published the memo yesterday, which shows what the agency truly thinks of itself. The talking points in this memo highlights items such as the NSA's thwarting of 54 terrorist attacks, the agency's protection of the entire world, and the incredible sacrifices that NSA agents make to protect our freedom. I spoke to Kevin earlier and started by asking him about the details behind the memo.
I obtained a copy of these talking points that the National Security Agency apparently sent out to employees ahead of the Thanksgiving holiday with the intent that these employees could talk about the talking points if the NSA came up during any dinner gatherings. So they were tasked with being ambassadors of the NSA and to talk about what the NSA leadership thinks they do as an agency.
And let's go through some of the specific points outlined in the memo. Number 2 claims that, quote, the NSA performs its mission the right way, lawful, compliant, and in a way that protects civil liberties and privacy. Kevin, what's your response?
Well, in the story that I wrote, I did a full deconstruction of each of the talking points. And for this one, I highlighted a foreign intelligence surveillance court opinion that found there had been instances of unauthorized electronic surveillance. This was about, the year was 2010. They were looking at the collection of emails, the program that was collecting internet communications, and found that the NSA was coming there routinely, making misstatements, not representing accurately the restraints that they had put on the collection of the internet communications, but also when making these representations, they were going beyond what they had told the court. So they were engaging in the collection of communications that they weren't authorized to communicate, which I take to be not being lawful and compliant.
Indeed, and this is my personal favorite, the most Orwellian of all. Number 5 states that, the, quote, the NSA is committed to increased transparency, public dialogue, and faithful implementation of any changes required by our overseers. Kevin, if that's the case, why is the entire FISA court secret?
Correct. That's good. And also, if that's the case, why do we have staff attorneys at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the American Civil Liberties Union who have spent the last 5 to 10 years trying to pry, we're not talking about how these programs work. We're talking about trying to pry what is the secret legal interpretation for whether our government, the United States government, can spy on us as citizens, or what sort of procedures do they have to follow, what authorization do they have to get to engage in foreign intelligence surveillance. You know, this sort of thing is something that the NSA does not want to talk about. They particularly didn't want to talk about it when warrantless wiretapping came up under the Bush administration. Into the Obama administration, we've just seen it legalized and expanded. And up until Edward Snowden, there was absolutely no dialogue.
What else stood out to you throughout the memo as just blatantly false?
Well, I looked at, they make this claim about not stealing industry secrets. I actually have to point to a colleague in my profession, Marcy Wheeler, who deconstructed that point and said, basically that they weren't denying that they steal industry secrets, just that they don't do it for competitive advantage. So it's not a commercial reason, it's more strategic. But we do know that based on documents that they have targeted the private networks of a company like the state-controlled Petrobras oil company in Brazil, and that they have in fact done some targeting of industry secrets. The other thing I looked at was the claims about not forcing changes to any vendor's products. I took that to be addressing any sort of revelations that have come out around them trying to weaken encryption. And it's just simply not true. ProPublica and the New York Times both published stories that showed that they did have a goal of undermining the encryption and trying to make sure that they could keep a sort of access to some of the products that might come out.
And everyone, check it out on Firedog Lake, Kevin, because you really do break it down, and there's so much more to really go over, including just blatantly false statistics that are peddled over and over again about how many terrorist attacks have been thwarted, et cetera, from this information. And really, I guess the ultimate question is, what does it say about the NSA that it has to send their employees talking points about the agency to talk to their own families?
There are two things I would say to that. One, I pointed out that these talking points, while they appear to be intended for family members of NSA employees, they could also be for NSA employees themselves. We had Edward Snowden say to New York Times reporter James Risen that he thought the dissent inside the ranks was palpable, that he could sense that there were people inside of the agency. I don't know how he knows this, but he was making a claim that people inside the agency do have problems with how the leadership is running the agency. But we've seen this before because we've had whistleblowers come out of the agency like Thomas Drake, we've had Kirk Wiebe, we've had others who have taken issue with how the NSA is coordinating its programs. So we know that this is reasonable assertion to make that dissent inside the NSA could be the issue. But then also, secondly, I would say that you're sending home a document that tells people how to rebut claims that the agency is violating the law, how to rebut claims that the agency is not respecting U.S. citizens' civil liberties. And I think that's a sad statement on the agency itself. I mean, you're having the employees do the work that you're failing to do, but you obviously are admitting that you're losing the game.
Let's talk about another recent NSA leak that the agency actually monitored the porn habits of 6 Muslim targets. How is the NSA justifying this practice?
The justification is that these are people who, while they are not engaged in terrorism, they admit that. I think we need to be clear here that none of these targets were accused of being involved in any terrorism. But regardless, they found these to be quote-unquote radicalizers. So people who had influence in these countries where the U.S. has operations, and they were concerned that these radicalizers were being effective in their dangerous views against the United States. And these views range from being things like, we believe the United States was behind 9/11, to things like, I think that people in my country that are from the U.S. military are foreign occupiers and they should not be respected, and in fact should be driven out by people in my country. And so these views are also a view that non-Muslim people should not be allowed in the country. So things like that. We're not talking about actual calls to violence against the United States necessarily. And regardless, these people were put under a microscope because the U.S. government, the NSA, thought it would be fun to try to discredit these individuals so that they could be less effective by embarrassing them, by showing, possibly exposing that they look at porn, so this goes against their religious values.
Real slippery slope there, Kevin, as you just mentioned. I mean, that's really, really shocking. I don't even know what to say about that. Let's move on because we're almost out of time. Let's talk about the fact that the media has completely shifted over from really talking about anything NSA to now just completely Obamacare. And also it just seems like not only the media coverage, but the public pressure on the NSA has really subsided since the bulk of the leaks came out. Is the public just jaded? I mean, what chance do you think that we'll see legislation pass in the near future, as we know the Amash Amendment nearly passed last time, that will actually limit the NSA's powers? We have about a minute left.
Well, what I'll say to that is that there are many, many more NSA stories to be coming out from even The Guardian, but then also from Glenn Greenwald, who has this new media project that he's going to be getting up next year. And so that's part of why you've seen this lull in activity around it, because we've had stories that
you get the idea. Now, you notice right here, we've got the phone number up. We're going to have live call-in right now. I haven't had it for a couple shows, but I figure a free speech zone, what better to call in and give your opinion. Now, during the Dealey Plaza commemoration of the JFK assassination, Alex Jones, who they called a conspiracy theorist, but actually he's a conspiracy analyst. I'm a conspiracy historian, or at least a buff. we're not conspiracy theorists here because we do very little analyzing of it. We just listen to other analysis. But the thing that got me was that, underneath the videos I was watching were comments, and some of the comments were quite peculiar. Like they were criticizing Alex Jones, who was supposedly treating the police very badly. He was, you scumbags. He was yelling on his mic, on his PA, we're not going to bow down to you. You're not going to take our liberties. Like that. You're all cowards. You're all cowards. He was talking about how they won't stand up for their oath to protect the Constitution, and he was yelling all that while they were herding them into free speech zones, right? Like cattle, meh, or sheep. And the comments were criticizing Alex Jones for, not being fair with the policemen. And of course I came back, and you can go to my 251 Omega on YouTube, and you can see all the comments that I've answered. But I answered, why on earth would you complain about how Alex Jones acted instead of, doesn't it bother you that people were herded into free speech zones? Doesn't that get you at all? Not to mention the fact that the Dealey Plaza wasn't going to be open to anybody except people who accepted the government's version. The brain-dead metal muffins. Okay, well, that's an Ace Hayes for you old-timers who watched cable access back in the early 90s and late 80s. That's Ace Hayes. You ought to go to the Ace Hayes Secret Government Seminar channel. I have 10 of his old shows posted. You might enjoy watching them. You can get a link on my 251 Omega YouTube page to Ace Hayes, and you might like it because he gave a lot of predictions 20 years ago that are coming true this day. Well, it appears that we don't have a lot of people knocking down the doors or shall we say ringing the phone off the hook to talk to us. So we're going to play a little bit of video as we go out here. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is your biggest enemy to internet freedom. So we're going to go ahead and play some of this. If they're ready in there, go for it.
The biggest threat to the internet you've probably never heard of. The TPP is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. TPP is a trade agreement being negotiated between more than 12 countries around the Pacific region.
We might have time left
It has
over.
more
If we
than
do,
26
I'll go
chapters,
back.
and it covers a broad spectrum of issues, from trade of dairy, meat, textiles, and automobiles, to financial regulation, to labor regulation,
Are they still there?
and more. But one chapter poses a huge threat to the internet. The chapter concerning intellectual property enforcement. We can't exactly know what's in that chapter
Since
because
they're not
TPP is being negotiated in secret.
I didn't notice
through
the time
a series
either.
of backroom
I think it
deals that
was-
shut out the public. Trade officials won't release the text of the agreement
Yeah, okay, let
or
them
even
stack
tell
up
us
and
what their policy
we'll go in there and I'll
on
wave
any
at you
issue.
or I'll
One thing we know
let it
is
in,
that while the
and then we'll
public
take what I
shut out
can
of the
before we go off the
negotiating
air.
process, private corporate interests aren't. In particular, big content industries are spending ginormous amounts of money in lobbying to convince policymakers that more aggressive and draconian copyright laws will lead to more innovation, more creativity, and more jobs. But in reality, that just isn't the case. If adopted, the copyright enforcement measures proposed in the TPP could make the internet intimidating and repressive. Users will be afraid to view, share, and interact with digital content. An early version of the text has been leaked, and you should be worried about what's inside. Internet service providers could be forced to become private copyright enforcers, lest they risk liability for the content posted by their users. While the TPP includes certain protection from liability, experience with similar provisions in the US suggests that ISPs will be encouraged to take down, filter, and block legitimate content, requiring only a private notice from an alleged copyright holder. The copyright industry is obsessed with restricting users from tinkering with devices and content, out of the fear that people will then use them for copyright infringing purposes. So what they do is install digital rights management software, or DRM, on devices to limit what users can do. Despite growing evidence that DRM does much more harm than good, this prevents consumers from unlocking their phones to change telecom carriers. Artists, like documentary filmmakers who break encryption on a DVD or sample online streaming videos, could face legal threats, even if the videos they create are legal. People with visual or reading disabilities can be prevented from changing the format of books and movies to make them more accessible. Not only that, DRM, backed by the full force of the law, can be used to stifle competition. For example, a company can block unauthorized software or content from working with their devices just by enabling DRM. Corporations claim that DRM is necessary to fight copyright infringement online and keep consumers safe from viruses. But there's no evidence that DRM does much to combat either of those things. Fans should not be treated like criminals, and companies should not get an automatic veto over user creativity, choice, and innovation. These are only some of the problems with the TPP's copyright enforcement provisions. They would be harmful for everyone, except for companies that use these policies to suppress innovative competitors or to criminalize sharing. Instead of spending their resources to create new products that respect the internet and new technologies, they're lobbying for policies that would hinder and break them. Severe copyright policies restrict our right to share, modify.
Okay, you get the idea. We have some calls I wanted to get to them before we went off. We have 2.5 minutes, so go ahead, caller.
Yes, hi. First, I want to thank you for...
Oh, turn off your audio in the background.
Yeah, it's off.
Okay.
First, I want to thank you for your show. And I wanted to address the question, why are people not in the streets demonstrating? And it's my opinion that people have seen that public demonstrations don't matter. That the politicians
I'm sure that's
have
part of
stopped
it.
listening, and they know that they can do whatever they want.
The other thing is that we've got a culture where, you know, the football game between OSU and Oregon State, or how, you know, I get them all mixed up, but anyway, those are more important than anything else in the world. I saw somebody driving down the street with those flags flying from that college game, you know, and I thought, how about flying a flag that says, you know, down with the NSA?
Yeah. Well, I think there are enough people who do care, but it's kind of pointless to try to express your views to the politicians because they don't really care what we think.
Well, you know, earlier when I read the report about the congressman in North Carolina who's trying to get a bill that'll free up the 28 pages redacted, I mean, that's a step in the right direction. I mean, we're now having people that are in government working along the right lines. It's not just us against the government anymore. I mean, it still is in a way, but it's so overwhelming. The information is so overwhelming. The only people still in denial are everybody in the government.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for
thank you
calling.
for your
We've
show.
got 17 seconds. See us again on the 21st, and then after that we'll be weekly.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.